Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents An Empire of Laws, Legal Pluralism in British Colonial Policy, by Christian R. Burset, narrated by Perry Daniels. Introduction. In 1782, Jeremy Bentham asked whether it would be possible to craft a body of laws that was fit for every society. His test case was Bengal, a place as different as can be from England, although Britain's East India Company, EIC, had controlled it for a quarter-century. Britons had debated for decades whether English law belonged in India, and Bentham knew the consensus that most of his contemporaries had reached. For them, English law stood near the summit of perfection, and although they considered English law to be the best in the world, they thought it was unsuitable for export. Laws which are fit for a free country, they reasoned, were, for that very reason, incompetent for a country where the government is arbitrary and despotical, a description that matched a growing share of Britain's empire. Bentham disagreed on both counts. On the one hand, he denied the goodness of English law. A great part of it was not only unfit for Bengal, but of such a nature as to be bad everywhere, including England. On the other hand, he challenged the assumption that Bengal and England needed radically different legal systems. Of course, the two places were dissimilar in many ways, including climate, culture, resources, and religion, and their institutions had to reflect that. Nor was uniformity desirable for its own sake. No law should be changed, he warned, without some specific, assignable benefit. But the existing laws in both countries left room for improvement, and in both England and Bengal, a reforming legislator would need to proceed from the same utilitarian principles. As a result, a system might be devised which, while it were better for Bengal, would also be better even for England at the same time. Bentham had no love for the common law, but he suggested that Britain might still pursue a common law for its empire. Although Bentham's tone was proudly contrarian, he knew that the dogma he attacked was young. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, Britain had usually tried to impose its own laws on the peoples it conquered. The laws of Britain's colonies were never identical to those of England, or to each other. Nobody thought that every part of English law made sense everywhere. Nonetheless, some version of English law generally followed the Union Jack. But that commitment to a common imperial law changed in the 1760s. Britain emerged from the 7 Years' War, 1754-63, with a greatly expanded empire. It had gained Quebec, the Illinois country, several West Indian islands, and Senegal from France. Spanish Florida had become British West Florida, including parts of present-day Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and East Florida. Meanwhile, the EIC was making itself the de facto sovereign of Bengal. In 1765, it gained the right to collect taxes from, and the responsibility to administer civil justice to, the region's 30 million inhabitants. In keeping with its past practice, Britain imposed English law on most of these places. But in Bengal, Quebec, and Illinois, it took a different path. The Quebec Act of 1774 applied French civil law and English criminal law to Quebec and Illinois. In Bengal, courts run by the Company and the Crown applied English, Hindu, or Islamic law, depending on the subject of the dispute and the status of the parties. In short, between the 1760s and the 1780s, the British Empire abandoned its old aspiration of a global common law in favor of a new policy of legal pluralism, in which the empire chose to administer different laws for different groups. This book explains why. The implications of this history go well beyond the 18th century. As the conclusion will reveal, It matters for how we think about law's effect on economic development, whether we should view law's history as contingent or path-dependent, and how we define empire itself. But despite the significance of the topic, this book is the first to explain Britain's new approach to colonial legal policy. To be sure, many scholars have written about colonial law, but their scope has typically been broader or narrower than mine, either investigating legal pluralism as a global phenomenon, as with Lauren Benton's path-breaking work, or addressing particular colonies or regions, rather than taking the British Empire as the unit of analysis. There have been important books about Britain's imperial constitution and how particular institutions or doctrines functioned within the empire, but nobody has made a sustained attempt to explain why the common law became less common in the crucial century between the Glorious and American Revolutions. Bringing the mind back in. One reason historians haven't examined Britain's imperial legal policy is that they've neglected imperial policy making more generally. The Victorian historian, J.R. Seeley, famously quipped that Britain had acquired its empire in a fit of absence of mind. Few historians today would let it off the hook so easily, and Seeley himself was only half serious. But the field has continued to follow his lead when it comes to law. State-of-the-art scholarship gives the impression that colonial legal systems emerged principally from the activities of litigants and local officials, not the grand designs of imperial policymakers. There's some truth to that, and it would be silly to depict colonial institutions as emerging fully armored from the head of some undersecretary in Whitehall. But it's worth re-examining the place of deliberate policy-making for colonial law, to insist on Britain's presence of mind not only when it conquered and peopled half the world, to quote Seeley again, but also in governing it. Several factors have discouraged historians from focusing on the policies that shaped imperial legal history. The first was the influential work of Sir Lewis Namier, 1888 to 1960, who gave plausibility to Seeley's quip by describing 18th-century politics as devoid of ideology. Hanoverian politicians, Namier wrote, no more dreamt of a seat in the House of Commons in order to benefit humanity than a child dreams of a birthday cake that others may eat it. In his telling, politics was a matter of interests and appetites, not ideas. With metropolitan politics evacuated of meaning, many historians of empire turned their attention to events in the colonies. Their pivot to the periphery was complemented by trends in legal history, which was paying more attention to the social contexts in which law operated. This, too, tended to draw attention to local rather than imperial arrangements. At most, empire was the stage on which the story unfolded. And story is the right word. The emphasis was on narrative and thick description more than causal explanation. Those approaches have been fruitful. Paying attention to local contexts has yielded richer and more realistic accounts of how people experience and construct legal authority. Concentrating on the colonies has revealed the limits of imperial power while highlighting the agency of colonial subjects. And a relaxed focus on causation has freed historians to spot patterns that span centuries and cross continents. But there have also been costs. Privileging local stories can make it hard to see what was distinctive about the British Empire as a whole, or to evaluate the role of the imperial state, rather than assuming its irrelevance. In response to such concerns, a growing number of British historians have emphasized the need to write truly imperial histories. Building on that insight, this book reasserts the importance of the imperial state for colonial legal history. That doesn't mean ignoring local factors or focusing only on elites. The story here features a wide variety of actors, not only ministers and members of Parliament, but also merchants, mid-level bureaucrats, and litigants from across the empire. But because this book seeks to explain why Britain pursued a particular set of policies, it will necessarily focus on the perspective of those policies' authors. Like every approach to writing history, this one also has its costs. The list of dramatis personae will sometimes look lopsided, and subalterns will speak more often through the pens of imperial politicians than in their own voices. Indeed, one of the themes of this book will be how British officials misinterpreted or misrepresented the laws and desires of the people they were trying to rule. The goal is to supplement, not replace, other ways of approaching colonial legal history. The law-destroying state? There's another reason historians have neglected Britain's embrace of colonial legal pluralism. They've forgotten to be surprised by it. Contemporaries like Bentham appreciated the novelty of Britain's decision to administer many kinds of laws. But by the early 20th century, when legal history first emerged as a modern field of study, Britain's policy had come to seem natural. As to the laws in force in the colonies, of course they vary greatly. F. W. Maitland, the father of English legal history, wrote in 1908, "It was too obvious to dwell on." Part of the problem is that legal pluralism is a slippery notion. If the phrase describes any situation in which the law varies from place to place, or from group to group, then it seems both ubiquitous and unremarkable. New York and New Jersey have different laws. Why not England and India? To complicate things further, writers have invoked legal pluralism to describe very different phenomena: internal variation within state law on the one hand, and the interplay between state and non-state sources of authority on the other. To avoid confusion, a definition is in order. This book explores strategic legal pluralism, a polity's deliberate application of different legal systems to different groups of people. Two features mark strategic legal pluralism. First, pluralism is manifest, to borrow a term from Brian Tamanaha. Participants view the legal systems in question as strikingly different from each other. Minor variations aren't enough. The laws must seem like different languages rather than dialects of a common tongue. One way to think about this is by asking whether a lawyer could easily practice across the legal divide. From that perspective, we can sense that Islamic and English law differ in a way that the laws of New York and New Jersey don't. Second, strategic legal pluralism reflects an official decision to administer multiple kinds of law. In other words, the concept isn't concerned with the competition between official and unofficial sources of authority. Instead, it focuses on situations in which the state itself deploys legal difference. With this definition in mind, legal pluralism starts to seem less natural. In fact, it's hard to square with some common assumptions about how states usually behave. For example, this is how Charles Tilly begins his classic study of state formation. The ruler of a small Mesopotamian city-state conquered all the region's other city-states and made them subject to Marduk, his own city's god. Hammurabi, ruler of Babylon, became the supreme king of Mesopotamia. By conquering, he gained the right and obligation to establish laws for all the people. On Tilly's account, to rule is to make everyone follow your rules. Max Weber lists the development of uniform law as one of modernity's defining attributes, while Robert Covert describes jurispathic states as pruning too much law into a uniform rule of civil justice. According to many historians, the British Empire shared this instinct for sameness. Mary Sarah Bilder presents the British Empire as trying to extend a uniform body of law across its colonies. When the British governed a country, Niall Ferguson tells us, there were certain distinctive features of their own society that they tended to disseminate, including the common law and English forms of land tenure. And yet, as these same authors acknowledge, colonial laws were rarely uniform in practice. If states lust after legal uniformity, why have they so rarely attained it? Scholars have offered three kinds of answers. Number one, some states are weak. A state might want uniformity but lack the capacity to achieve it. Jean-Laurent Rosenthal and Roy Bin Wong, for example, argue that rulers in early modern Europe feared legal pluralism but accepted it to reduce the likelihood of revolt and because it was often the only way to secure prompt tax revenue. Brian Tamanaha writes that in most situations of manifest legal pluralism, the state had no real choice in the matter because state law was too weak to trump indigenous legal forms or to replace the functions they fulfilled. Legal pluralism is an offer the state can't refuse. Number two, some states are tolerant. Alternatively, a state might feel it has a moral or legal duty to administer multiple kinds of law. Scholars of law and religion, for instance, have sometimes described the accommodation of religious law in liberal democracies as an example of this. Number three, empires are a special case. Or perhaps empires are different from other kinds of states. As Jane Burbank and Frederick Cooper tell us, the very concept of empire presumes that different people within the polity will be governed differently. That might be because empires lack the strength to project uniform laws onto faraway places. Alternatively, legal pluralism might be a technique of domination, an aspect of what Partha Chatterjee has termed the rule of colonial difference, in which imperial rule depends on a distinction between colonizer and colonized. Whatever the case, pluralism is simply a fact of imperial law. These three explanations are not mutually exclusive. In fact, historians of the British Empire have sometimes explained its acceptance of legal pluralism as the product of limited state capacity, reinforced by a growing commitment to toleration. That's partly true, but it leaves out the most important part of the story. This book's argument. The 18th-century British Empire didn't stumble into legal pluralism because it was too weak to avoid it, because of a reflexive commitment to colonial difference, or because it felt obliged to administer the laws of the people it conquered. Instead, Britain's selective denial of English law to its colonies reflected a conscious effort to shape their political and economic development. 18th-century Britons believed that English law could turn any territory into an anglicized commercial colony like Britain's earlier American settlements. Just as English law had transmuted Dutch New Amsterdam into English New York, the common law could work the same alchemy on the former subjects of Bourbon and Mughal empires. Legal pluralism, in contrast, would keep colonies culturally distinct, politically dependent, and economically subordinate. Thus, by deciding how much English law each colony received, British officials could determine what kind of colony it would become. Britain's selective turn toward legal pluralism after 1763 reflected the triumph of a particular vision of the British Empire, politically hierarchical, economically extractive, and culturally tolerant. It wasn't inevitable that Britain would take this path. From the middle of the 17th century until the 1760s, what historians sometimes call the First British Empire, England and then Britain preferred that its colonies conform to English law. What that meant in practice was contested. Depending on the occasion, English law could be identified with a body of doctrines, a set of institutions and procedures, or even a certain way of thinking, what J.G.A. Pocock has labeled the common law mind. There were ambiguities about whether the laws of England included statutes or only the common law, and whether common law should be defined broadly to encompass equity, admiralty, and ecclesiastical law. But despite disagreements about the definition of English law, English commentators generally agreed that it ought to rule the empire. Other legal systems sometimes survived, most prominently in Scotland, but not as the favored outcome of London's legal and political elite. As Chapter 1 explains, that remained true even after Montesquieu and other Enlightenment philosophers started to insist that law was intertwined with local climatic, geographic, and cultural conditions. In fact, some of Montesquieu's earliest British readers saw no conflict between his writings and their own efforts to forge a common law for Britain and its empire. To the contrary, they believed that his Spirit of the Laws, 1748, was consistent with an aggressive campaign to anglicize the laws of Scotland in the wake of the 1745 Jacobite uprising. Britain's commitment to a common law empire began to waver after the 7 Years' War, as Chapter 2 explains. Although Britain had defeated its chief European and Asian rivals, its victory struck many observers as precarious. The war had been hugely expensive, and the scale of Britain's new possessions amplified long-standing anxieties about the empire's stability. These concerns sparked an aggressive effort to remake imperial governance, and a backlash that culminated in the American Revolution. They also generated a new debate about whether Britain could survive as a common law empire. In the 1760s, there were three basic visions for the empire's future, each of which had different implications for colonial legal policy. This book will refer to supporters of these visions as populists, paternalists, and moderates, respectively. Those terms are deliberately anachronistic, and they're meant to evoke ideological tendencies rather than organized parties. There were political parties at the time, but their memberships were unstable, and even experienced politicians struggled to define them. Traditional partisan labels like Whig and Tory had lost much of their meaning, and they were more often used as rhetorical cudgels than as neutral descriptors. Indeed, what it meant to belong to a party was itself a contested question. Accordingly, this book will focus on ideologies rather than party allegiances, although there was substantial overlap between them. Populists wanted to create a relatively inclusive empire in which the residents of Britain and its colonies enjoyed similar political status and economic opportunity. Inclusive here has the same sense suggested by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, who use that term for institutions that allow and encourage participation by the great mass of people in economic and political life, rather than funneling wealth and power to a narrow elite. Inclusivity is relative. Populists could be remarkably intolerant of religious and cultural minorities, even by 18th-century standards. But compared to their opponents, populists envisioned greater parity between Britain and its colonies, and, to some extent, between Britons and their conquered subjects. In Parliament, populists were led by William Pitt, later 1st Earl of Chatham, and William Petty, 2nd Earl of Shelburne. Populist ideas also attracted many future leaders of the American Revolution. On both sides of the Atlantic, populists were sometimes called patriots. Paternalists focused on maintaining a stable empire and on extracting wealth from the colonies to solve Britain's fiscal woes. In many respects, their priorities reversed those of the populists. Paternalists were less economically and politically egalitarian, but more culturally and religiously tolerant. Their leaders included William Murray, 1st Earl of Mansfield, the influential Lord Chief Justice, as well as politicians linked to George Grenville and John Russell, 4th Duke of Bedford. Their enemies sometimes called them Tories, although paternalists mostly thought of themselves as Whigs. Moderates, as the name suggests, pursued a middle path, presenting themselves as the true heirs of the Whig tradition. They criticized both paternalists' eagerness to subordinate the colonies and populists' lack of concern for colonial minorities. Edmund Burke was the moderates' intellectual heavyweight, Lord Rockingham their parliamentary leader. Each of these groups tried to use colonial law to effect its vision of empire. The idea that different kinds of law might produce different kinds of colonies had a long history. Since the early 17th century, colonial governments had used the promise of English law to lure settlers. But starting in the 1760s, paternalists explored new ways of manipulating colonies' legal systems for developmental purposes. Their first project was an attempt to resurrect feudalism in North America. Most audiences today are more likely to associate feudalism with the age of chivalry than the age of enlightenment. But for some imperial policymakers, including Thomas Gage, the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America, and John Percival, 2nd Earl of Egmont, the future lay in a legal system that linked political power to land ownership. The second paternalist project was to use state-sponsored arbitration as a substitute for courts in certain colonies. Paternalists worried that litigiousness was tearing the empire apart, and they hoped that more informal modes of dispute resolution might restore harmony to Britain's increasingly diverse empire. At the same time, paternalists hoped that the absence of courts might deter immigration to places that it was in Britain's interest to keep underdeveloped, such as the American interior. The failure of these initiatives led paternalists to the more radical project of using foreign laws to tame the empire. Chapter 3 tells that story for the colonies that Britain had taken from France and Spain: Quebec, Illinois, Senegambia, Florida, and the ceded islands in the West Indies. For most of these new acquisitions, there was a broad consensus that Britain should continue its old policy of introducing English law in order to facilitate the development of anglicized settlements. But when it came to Illinois and Quebec, politicians divided sharply about what kind of colonies they wanted. As a result, they disagreed about whether to introduce English law or to retain the laws that had been in place under France. Paternalists wanted to make Quebec and Illinois easy to govern and economically dependent on the rest of the empire, and they thought that retaining French law would advance that goal in 3 ways. First, paternalists worried that English law had become excessively libertarian, and they hoped that French law would promote a sense of obedience. Legal pluralism would also make colonists easier to control by cutting off those colonies from the rest of North America. Divide and rule is a common imperial strategy, but paternalists gave it a particular economic twist. Withholding English law would discourage the immigration and investment Quebec needed to develop advanced commercial economies, because British settlers and merchants would refuse to entrust their bodies or their property to jurisdictions that lacked English law. Populists and moderates, in contrast, wanted to transplant English law in order to create an integrated empire in which colonial subjects enjoyed the same political status and economic opportunities as people in England. A global common law, populists argued, would encourage Anglophone immigration. These new arrivals would stimulate economic development and hasten the assimilation of Britain's newest subjects. The Quebec Act of 1774, which restored French civil law to Quebec and Illinois, marked the triumph of the paternalist vision of empire over populist and moderate alternatives. Chapter 4 takes the story to India. In many ways, the debate about what law to apply to Bengal mirrored the debate over Quebec and Illinois. Once again, a group of populists wanted to install English law to create an anglicized settler colony, and their opponents fought to withhold English law in order to create a more extractive, hierarchical, and culturally distinctive colony. But there were also important differences between the North American and Indian debates. In Bengal, the most intense disagreement after the mid-1760s was about what kind of legal pluralism to administer, not whether to accept legal pluralism at all. One group of EIC officials, led by Robert Clive, saw legal pluralism primarily as a way to facilitate the collection of taxes while avoiding the fiscal and moral costs of governance. Another group, led by Warren Hastings, took a more interventionist approach that sought simultaneously to preserve Indian laws and reconstruct them in order to facilitate the company's extractive project. This tension between preserving Indian
Sample complete. Ready to continue?